Hi, Anthony, it's David here. I thought I'd just complete the picture as regards the potential effects of Trump policies on the US dollar. Okay, the first thing to say is that the US dollar, for all the historical reasons, legality, depth of the markets, risk-free securities, rule of law, and all that stuff, has been the reserve currency since 1947. But all the reasons we give for the dollar being the reserve currency are reasons that relate to the past. They are the reasons that the US dollar is the reserve currency now. They were not prescribed reasons of when the US dollar became the world reserve currency. It drops out of the US dollar being the reserve currency, but it is not necessarily the cause. You have to remember that. Okay, now, the US dollar runs constant current account deficits. The US. That means the pool of global dollar liquidity is constantly growing. And the reason it is growing is because when you run current account deficits, you are leaving more dollars in the hands of the people who sell you goods than you are getting back from charging them for the goods that you sell to them. So the current account deficit is really the service station which pumps fuel into the tank of international commerce, and particularly the globalized economy and thus globalization. If the US diminishes its current account deficit, which will be for two reasons. Number one, tariffs will make the US economy grow much more slowly because you're substituting a nationalistic economy for a globalized one. You're substituting an inefficient one for an efficient one. But also the tariffs have the aim of reducing the US current account deficit by diminishing imports. If you do that, then you can see that you are pumping less US dollars into the global dollar pool every year. So the combination of slower US growth because of the nationalistic economic policies and a lower US current account deficit combine to mean that the US dollar is no longer pumping the money into the global liquidity pool that is needed for the emergence of economies like the global south, etc., which will be growing faster than the US and will be trading increasingly among themselves. So global south to global south, China to global south, Europe to China, Europe to the global south, and all of that. So you will have a high-speed economic growth system outside of the US, and the US will be no longer, not only by policy, but by the economic consequence of lower growth and lower current account deficits, the US will not be funding the dollars, supplying the dollars to fund that growth. But that growth, that higher rate of growth in those other countries than the US will need US dollars. But they won't get them. So there has to be a new reserve currency and trading currency. Of course, when I say reserve currency, it's not only the stock of wealth function or the measuring of trade function, it's also the means of payment. So the means of payment in the faster growth part of the world will need a new currency to be the international, the global reserve currency, either parallel or in the place of the US dollar. Now, what could that currency be? Well, there is no currency that fully meets all the criteria I mentioned in the beginning as reasons why the US dollar is the global reserve currency. So we're going to have to settle for something different, not necessarily second class, but something different. But the candidates are, of course, the euro, which is already 20% of your global reserves, or the renminbi in some form of offshore, almost like a swap arrangement, trading currency and reserve currency, which would be automatically or by legally X'd out of the political vagaries of China. Now, China has already got 32 swap arrangements with other central banks, which actually work on that principle. So China doesn't have a current account deficit. It doesn't have the depth of market in risk-free securities, and it doesn't have the rule of law of the United States. But that doesn't mean you can't create an offshore Chinese renminbi, maybe an e-renminbi, which actually can be sufficiently anesthetized, sufficiently aseptic of national Chinese characteristics in order for it to serve as a means of payment between certainly China and the global south. And the third possibility is the SDR. Now, oddly enough, it was Mark Carney who came up with the idea of the SDR being the reserve currency and transaction currency of the future to replace the US dollar, which imposed US financial conditions on all countries which were often not suited to their stage of development or their economic cycle. So the Carney SDR could happen, particularly if the US under Trump withdraws from the IMF. At that point in time, China would dominate the IMF. It already dominates 23 branches and sub-institutions of the IMF. And if the America withdrew, then it could see the way quite clearly to creating a new type of SDR as a substitute for the dollar. Okay, that's all I have to say about that. But I kind of thought it might be interesting for you to have this, because we didn't discuss this aspect. We discussed the aspect of the dollar being dethroned by the end of US exceptionalism, which is of course quite true. That's to do with the relative economic performance of the United States. This is actually to do with the fact that even if the US achieves its policy goals, then the automatic arithmetic mechanically requires that the US find an alternative or at least a parallel reserve currency to the US dollar. Thanks a lot.